Well, it looks like we're at time, so I guess we'll kick off. I want to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. On behalf of the SMDM Career Development Committee, I'm really pleased to welcome you to our panel. My name is Logan Treneman. I'm a postdoc at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and at the University of California at Davis. For those that have joined the annual meeting in the past, this panel is a mainstay of the Career Development Committee's activities. And every year we try to tackle one important topic that's been identified by the members of the community. So in past years, our panels have focused on how to learn from failure or how to become a better presenter. And today's panel is going to focus on publishing. It's an important part of research, but it can be challenging for early career and established researchers alike. So to help us navigate this, we've assembled 3 stellar panelists to provide some perspective and to answer some questions. I want to get right into it, but before I get the panelists to introduce themselves, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of how we want it to work today. So the panel is going to be very informal. There's not going to be any slides or presentations. So after discussion, we've decided to reserve the entirety of our 1-hour session for audience questions. Of course, I have some questions prepared, but I want to encourage those in the audience to participate. And the way you can do that is by raising your hand. And even though I can see a lot of you, I don't mean literally. Under the participants bar, if you click on it at the bottom, you'll notice that there are some yes, no emojis. One of those is the raise hand. So if you have a question, just click on that. I'll be able to see that you have your hand raised, and then I can call on you to ask a question. We'd ask that everyone stays muted when you're not asking a question. And if by chance your question gets answered while you're waiting to ask it, you can always drop your hand to be removed from the queue. We're going to try to get to everyone, but apologies in advance if we can't do that. So I think I've done enough talking. I'm going to ask our 3 panelists to introduce themselves. So Sadia, Brian, and Miriam, can you please introduce yourselves in that order, and then we'll kick off.
Thank you so much, Logan. My name is Dr. Sadia Sadiq-Sada. I'm a psychiatrist at St. Michael's, psychiatrist and a clinician investigator at St. Michael's Hospital and at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I know my bio said Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. That is accurate. Last year, I did my Science Masters in Health Policy and Management there. And I think I see Ankur in the audience. Ankur Pandya was, I guess, my master's thesis supervisor when I was down there at Harvard. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Zickman Fisher. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the US. I'm a decision psychologist by training. I've been a member of SMDM for over, I guess now 20 plus years. And most of my work is in space of patient education and risk communication and health communication design. And I have the honor and privilege of being the incoming editor-in-chief of SMDM's journals, Medical Decision Making and MDM Policy and Practice, which I'll be starting to take over in January. So certainly plenty of thoughts on the question about publication, especially within our journals.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Hunink. I'm a professor of clinical epidemiology and radiology at the Erasmus Medical Center, where this beautiful background is. That's our education building. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Harvard School of Public Health in the Health Decision Sciences. I see a lot of people here that I know very well that have either been my PhD student or are PhD students or I'm collaborating with. Great to have you here on in this meeting. I'm giving the word back to Logan.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start off with one question related to, we're at a conference where a lot of people are presenting their research and maybe thinking about where they're going to go in terms of publication. Sadia, last year, I believe you published in the New England Journal. I mean, I just wanted to get maybe your thoughts on what that process was like, how you decided to go to that journal and what that was like for you.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that question. I mean, for those who don't know, I wrote this piece called Sister First, Doctor Second. It was a truly personal piece. It was a perspective piece that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. It was about my experience being, well, the title says it, being both a sister to someone with, my brother has schizophrenia, and then while also being a physician. And I ultimately became a psychiatrist. And it doesn't take much to think about what made me decide to pursue that career. Certainly that inspired my interest in wanting to treat mental illnesses. And this was truly a story that had been in my heart and on my chest for a very long time. And it really has been a journey from my own sort of self-stigma about kind of hiding it and not really sharing it with people, to eventually getting it published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it was a whole journey there. And what I chose to do was I took a writing course. It was actually at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. And while I was there, I took a course on how to write for policy and policymakers. And one assignment was to do something that was an advocacy piece. So I actually started off by writing this as an assignment. And I'm so glad that I did that, because it kind of forced pen to paper. And then in terms of getting it to NEJM, that's what I call it, NEJM. I guess I was just feeling really ambitious. You know, I felt like the other pieces, like I was in Boston, I was at Harvard, and I was at the Harvard School of Public Health. So actually, the New England Journal of Medicine is actually physically located its office within the library that I was studying in. So I was always passing it by every day whenever I took the elevator or came in and out. And it felt like that much more accessible in a weird way, because I was physically close to it, as weird as that sounds. And then I just gathered up the courage and thought, you know what, I'm gonna go for it. And I remember in NEJM, they give you 7 days. They let you know within 7 days. And I remember it was like the last hour at like 7 days, like the last hour that they got back to me saying that they were interested in going ahead with it, which really caught me by surprise. I think it caught my partner even more by surprise, because he's published a lot more than me. And I also add that this is my first kind of single author, first author publication. And I almost feel like my career is ruined because I published at NEJM. So where do I go next? So yeah, that's a bit about my experience. I'm happy to share more about what that was like.
Yeah, I guess throwing over to the other panelists in terms of kind of how you make that decision about which journal you approach first, or maybe thinking about kind of like a trajectory of journals that you might apply to go to sequentially. Do the other panelists have any thoughts on kind of how you approach that process?
Sure, I'll jump in here. You know, I think there's a couple things that strike me. One is I do want to make sure to comment on, you know, Sadia's experience in terms of, you know, feeling like even the New England Journal was accessible. At least to acknowledge the reverse, that there are often situations in which people feel like journals are not accessible, like, oh, I would never reach there, et cetera. And to be a little aware that that might inhibit you in situations where you really could reach for a journal. To me, always the question is, who needs to see this? Who is the right audience for this? And whether that's a journal with a high impact factor, or that's a journal that focuses on a particular community, or a journal that is going to be seen by those who are most able to act on whatever it is you want to talk about, that becomes the most critical thing for me. You know, at different points in time, you may say, hey, this is a really great work. Let's shoot for high impact journals, and be willing to take the time. You may get rejected a few times, but you're gonna take that effort because you believe in the quality of your work. And other times they're going to be like, you know, I know who this needs to go to, so let me just send it right there from the beginning. And so there's no, from my standpoint, there's no one pathway about how you choose which journal. It really depends upon the paper and who you're trying to reach with it.
So I can add to that, and I agree with Brian. I like his approach, and I use that a lot myself too. But as a mentor, I also add in something else, and that is I'd like to consider what the future career of my mentee is going to be. So a PhD student who's just beginning to publish, I really want to know, is this person, you know, planning on being a radiologist? Well, then we need to shoot for a radiology journal, because that's where that person will be seen, and that will help get that person into that specialization. So the, you know, and other fields, of course. So I do take that into consideration as well. And another thing that I like doing is, together with the mentee, the student or the PhD student, I like making a list. So like, you know, we're going to start here, and then if that journal rejects, which, you know, is very likely since it will be the first journal we go to, use the comments that the reviewers give, if you get comments from the reviewers, and go to the second journal. And then you have this list, and you see, what makes sense in that list. And it saves a lot of time, and it saves a lot of frustration when you get the rejection. Because the worst thing that can happen is when it gets rejected and then it sits around, you in previous years in the drawer of your desk, but now somewhere on your computer for 3 months, and nothing happens to it, because it's not going to get accepted when it's on your computer doing nothing there. It needs to go out again to the next journal. And rejection, don't take it personally. So that's all part of the game, and it's just, the editor just wasn't interested, or the reviewers weren't interested. It's not a personal thing. It's got to do with the material of the paper.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one other piece I'd add is, like, I feel similarly in terms of coming up with a list. I have found that really helpful as well. And yeah, rejections happen, or revise and resubmits happen, and the paper will change shape over time. And I think it gets better and better. And I will say that has also modified what journals I aim for as well. And you kind of get a sense of, journals that might not be as higher impact, but I really respect some of the pieces that have come out of it. And so I would say initially my approach has been going for the highest impact. But that has definitely changed over the course of the year, and I think it's for the best.
Okay. Just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, please go down into the participants bar and you can click on the raise hand emoji. And go to our first audience question from Channing.
Sure, thanks, Logan. So my question for you, my first question, I should say, because I have many for you all, is I really appreciate this feedback about having a list of journals to target. And I'm wondering if you all use or support things like Jane or these other search engines where you can kind of like throw your abstract in there and it tells you what journals would be the best fit.
I've never heard of it, and I've never used it.
So I have mixed feelings about this. And part of that is because I think, at least at the moment, I don't think from an automated standpoint, you're really getting into the question of the fit. Right? You can look for sort of what journals publish articles on particular topics most often. But topic isn't necessarily going to be the thing that defines where a paper has the greatest potential impact. And impact here, I don't mean impact factor as in citations, although that's obviously related. I mean, will it be read by the people who go, yes, that is important, I need to remember that. And impact sometimes happens through high impact factor journals, and sometimes it happens through being in the right place at the right time. And so I've got a brief story I wanted to share from early in my career of an example of this. I get very interested early in my career about when we return test results to people, do we put labels on them or not? Do we call a test positive or not? And the example that kept coming up when I talked to people about this was, prenatal screening. So I developed a study, and it was a very simplistic study, but it was very focused on the obstetrics application. And I sent the paper to one of the major obstetrics journals, and I will never forget the reviews I got back. Because first of all, it was one of the few times in my career I've ever gotten a provisional acceptance on the first submission. And one of the reviewers basically said, we've been arguing about this question for decades. Nobody's ever had data to try and answer it. The data aren't perfect. There are flaws in this study, but it's really relevant to us. We need to publish this. And I always took away from that idea, I wouldn't have guessed that kind of response just saying I was going to an obstetrics journal, but obviously it hit a chord with the audience in a way that made it something that the editors really felt and the reviewers felt like it was appropriate for that journal. And so that's the question I think we always need to ask.
Can I have a follow-up question? So first of all, a couple people have private messaged me about Jane, so I threw the website to it in the chat for everyone. But then my second question is, so someone like me, like I'm very familiar with like the big ones, New England, JAMA, JGIM, those journals. But how do we learn about some of the more relevant journals that might be good for our topic, like you were just talking about, Brian, that we may not be as familiar with? You're on mute, Brian.
I wasn't actually saying anything, just trying to wrestle through with my thoughts here. I think my first thought is you can do some investigation yourself, like look through the tables of contents, see what kinds of stuff. I mean, when I was very early on in my career, one of the things I did was to pull up the archives of medical decision making. And that was part of what convinced me that this society and that journal was of interest to me, because I could see papers that I looked at and said, oh, they published that, they would be interested in what I do too. But also, I think, tap into the knowledge of mentors and of colleagues in those particular fields. Like, I really respect when I go to, let's say, a gastroenterologist and I say, you know, I've got this question, it's related to people's risk perceptions related to colon cancer. Would this journal be interested in it? Because they generally know. They'll either say, yeah, sure, that might be interested, or no, they're totally interested in other kinds of stuff. And I've had a few of those conversations over time.
I'd also add, I mean, I think a lot of us here are active on Twitter. I feel like Twitter has really changed. In many ways, it's kept me more up to date on the literature, on whatever field I'm interested in. It's always really fun to see people share either their own publications or something that they have found really interesting. And then being a part of a social network through Twitter has been really helpful in that if there's like a particular theme for a journal that I'm not familiar with, someone might message me and say, hey, like this journal is doing this particular theme and they're recruiting submissions, so you should try this. And so, you know, I really do think Twitter has been really helpful for me in identifying journals that I wouldn't have known about before.
Yeah, so I just use the good old-fashioned method that Brian was suggesting, looking at what's been published there, relying on journals that I know in particular areas. What I really have trouble with is all these new journals coming out. And sometimes I have no idea whether this is a reasonable journal or not. So I don't know, Brian, if you could say anything along those lines.
You know, the new journals are always complicated. Sometimes this is a question of, you know, journals leveraging, you know, the family of journals reputation, like you've got all the JAMA journals or BMJ journals, and, you know, MDM has MDM policy and practice. Hopefully in that context, you can get some sense as to what the orientation of those new journals really are. But I also do think that this is a question where if you're seriously considering the journal and you're really not clear whether or not something is appropriate for it or not, it's not a ridiculous idea to reach out to the editors. You know, you don't have to send them the manuscript, but just simply, you know, is this a kind of paper that you would be interested in? I remember early on in my career, my mentor and I had a paper we thought was going to be relevant for a particular journal based upon its title. And we sent it to them and they basically said, yeah, we're no longer interested in this kind of stuff. Good to know. Now I no longer send those kinds of papers there. You know, that kind of inquiry is not a ridiculous thing to do. I do think that sometimes authors are hesitant to contact editorial offices when it might be useful. And by the way, I want to say one other thing, which is we're sort of generally talking here about sort of original research type articles, but if you're talking about other kinds of things, whether commentaries or tutorials or those kinds of things, then it really does make even more sense to contact the editorial office and find out whether they're going to be interested in it or not.
Yeah, I've done that a lot in the past and it saves an enormous amount of time.
Just to jump off that, you know, I've had that experience specifically on like commentary. I have decided to start reaching out and I have found that helpful. You know, when someone tells me no, then I'll just move along. I have had the experience where a journal that I really respect said they were very interested and there was a very unique format of the article. So in the end, it was peer reviewed. And I actually thought the reviewers' comments suggested that they would be interested in going ahead, but the editorial board made an editorial decision not to go ahead with it. So that was a bit hard to take because they said that they were interested and I thought it was going to go ahead. And especially it's challenging when it's a very unique format and then you have to go back to the drawing board and reformulate it for another journal. So I've had that experience too.
We're going to jump to another audience question. Just a reminder for those who maybe joined late, if you'd like to ask a question under the participants bar, there's a raised hand icon. If you click that, then I know that you're interested in asking one. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Nancy Bolos. I'm a postdoc in St. Jude Hospital. And I'm working on cost effectiveness simulation model. And I noticed that most of the big journals like JAMA and NAJM and other journals, they accept cost effectiveness models, but I think they dedicate a very small proportion from their from the papers that they accept to that type of study. And I looked at previous accepted papers. Some of them are like really small topics, like for example, using the moisturization for atopic dermatitis, the cost effectiveness of that was accepted for JAMA. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how can I make is it like, what criteria that they decide if this cost effectiveness model is going to be accepted in a paper like JAMA or not? Is it the topic itself, or how can I make my model more acceptable in this type of journal?
So let me try and leap in on this, and with a few ideas, although there's obviously no hard and fast rules. One piece here is obviously there's a question of novelty, right? Something that is just a mechanical implementation of well-established mechanisms, approaches, is going to have a different set of journals being interested in it than something that represents a completely novel approach. Certainly for journals like medical decision making, where we care about methodology, that's one of our criteria. Is there a novel component? Is there a way that something is demonstrating that it's new that others might then follow what is being demonstrated in this particular paper? But I think the broader idea here is the scope of people who will be interested in the answer. Whether it's a narrow topic or a broad topic, if this is answering a critical question that has broad implications, let's say for clinical practice or for policy implications, you're going to have journals that are higher impact factor be more interested in that because they expect a larger proportion of their readership will be interested in it. Really good work that is only going to be of interest to a smaller subgroup of the audience is going to have a harder time going to those broader journals. Those kinds of papers will be seen most likely as interesting by more targeted journals where, again, a higher proportion of their readership is going to be interested in that particular topic. So again, it sort of goes back to this audience fit question. How is the takeaway message of that paper aligning with the interests of that journal's readership?
Thank you.
Any other thoughts from the other panelists? I'd like to jump on kind of a personal question. So one thing I always think about is authorship order. And as a trainee, I think it's a very challenging thing to navigate. So knowing kind of what you have to negotiate and when to have those conversations, whether decisions about authorship order on a paper are fixed at the beginning and don't change over time. Do you have any recommendations for trainees on how we might navigate those conversations, or maybe even mentors and how they can kind of help us work with the other authors on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question for me to answer as the first one. I think the mentor has an important role to play here. I think the mentor should guide the first author in deciding who's going to be in which order, and also when to ask co-authors to participate, because it's a whole game. And I personally, I like identifying the first, the second, and the last author very early on in the game, and the rest of the authorship later on in the game. So I think that the first author is going to pull the ship, and the second author is going to help that first author do that. And clearly the last author supervises the whole thing and is usually the mentor. And all the others from third to the second last, they play a role, and the ordering is not that important there. So then comes the order of the first and the second author. Now that can sometimes be tricky too, because certainly in our institution, the first and the second author are very often PhD students, and they need the paper for their PhD. And a first authored paper counts more than a second authored paper. So quite often what we tend to do, if it's really a dual effort, which I very much appreciate when that happens and encourage, then I go for the dual first author position type of approach, which I think really is a fantastic opportunity to get real collaboration and get people to really work together very well. So Brian, what do you think about this dual author, first authorship?
So my feeling on this is, in the situations where you, like your ones where you describe, where you really have a pair of people who are working together to shape a project, to shape a paper all the way through, I have no problems conceptually with it. What we want is authorship to reflect the degree of contribution that different authors are doing. And by the way, there are certainly contexts in which it doesn't necessarily align to the roles you laid out, right? I can think of papers in my CV where there was not really a senior supervising author. There was just multiple peers, and we had to navigate this question of, well, who's going to get last? They're not really being senior supervisor, but it's an important position, and so how do we talk about what role each person is going to play on a particular paper? I agree with Miriam, though, especially for the more significant authorship positions, raising that issue early on is important, both for ensuring commitment of the people who are going to take those roles, but also for enabling those who won't have those roles to know that they're not going to have those roles and not have sort of bad feelings about investing lots of time in, and then feeling like they didn't get what they thought they were going to get out of that experience. And I've seen that unfortunately happen in situations where somebody thought that they were going to be, say, second author, and then it turned out they weren't, and they really had some bad feelings about that because it wasn't made clear early enough.
I have to say that, well, a couple of things. One is that I have been relying definitely on my mentors for guidance, so in line with what Miriam was saying, for the mentor to kind of guide what makes sense in terms of authorship. And then I have been more recently in situations where I think that discussion hadn't happened really early on, and then conversations can unfortunately get really ugly, and I have learned that the hard way over the course of the year. And it was a really good learning experience for me. It really showed me how important it is to have those discussions super early on. I also just want to make a comment that I really wish that this wasn't the nature of publishing. I wish that we weren't in a system where first author and last author was what mattered the most, because I really wish it was a more collectivistic, but this is the system that I'm a part of. And I do think offering co-first authorship or even co-final authorship is a small act of resistance in allowing for others to get an opportunity to also enjoy that status or that rank in a paper.
I will say one other thing here, which is we're talking about this as if this decision only happens sort of in isolation around one paper. But of course, rarely is research just one paper. Often there are multiple papers coming from a project. And when you look at authorship more holistically within the context of a larger project, then many of these things can potentially be worked out. Like, I'll lead this one, you lead that one kinds of conversations make a lot of sense. And certainly that was the way in which I navigated multiple situations throughout my career in which multiple people were really invested in a piece of work, but we were able to say, okay, fine, you will be lead on this one, but I will then be the lead on that one. And we were all comfortable with resolving those issues that way.
Excellent. I'm going to actually read a question out of the chat because this is, again, something that I think will resonate with a lot of people. It comes from Sarah Monroe. She wants to know whether people have a story about a paper that's been rejected over and over and over, and a paper that takes years and years to get published, and how you actually go through that and how you have the resolve to continue submitting over time.
Yeah, I've been there lots of times. It's just a matter of keeping going. And this list helps, because then you don't waste time, being frustrated. You just say, oh, turn around, next journal, off we go. The saying is, it will get published somewhere, at some point in time. Yeah, you just keep going. The most frustrating as a mentor, I find, is when I see that a student has a fantastic paper has, attempted to get it published in like 3 or 4 journals and then gives up. And we as a team, we've put in a lot of time and effort into this paper, and it's an important paper. It needs to get published, and then the PhD student, is off doing residency training in cardiology or something else, and just doesn't have time to revise and resubmit and keep this process going. That I find really very difficult to handle. I very often don't know what to do with that.
I think the one thing I would add on this is, if, as we're, what's the reason? And I don't mean what the reviewers are saying. I mean, from your perspective as an author, what's the reason why things are not getting published? Right? Sometimes the answer is the reviewers have forced you to face the truth that the paper just isn't that whatever, right? It could be it has some flaws in its design. It could be whatever, and there are papers like that where you have to face the music and recognize it isn't the be all and end all. And then the question is, what do you do about that? Like, do you go to a lower journal? Do you change the paper, right? I've definitely seen papers in which we've like hacked off parts because we realized that part wasn't that good and focused in on the better part of the paper. Sometimes that's the choice. Sometimes it's just a question of you didn't have the fit, right? It's a perfectly good paper, but you've been throwing it over and over and over at journals that are just not seeing it as core to their brand, to their readership. In which case, maybe you were doing that because you were seeking a high impact factor journal. Well, you can keep doing that, or you can say, okay, let's move to the place where this will actually be a good fit for that particular target audience. And I can think of one paper where co-author got really frustrated with the paper over and over again and had just sort of thrown up their hands. And I finally basically said, look, if you can't move this on, I think we can get this out someplace, let me take it on. And I nudged it out to a journal. It wasn't the best journal, but it was a journal that would be a respectable place for this. And it got published there. And I remember my co-author thanking me afterwards for sort of helping them get past the emotion of the rejection and recognize that there was value in the paper and that we needed to keep going with it.
Excellent. I'm going to turn to another audience question from Ross Duncan.
Hi, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask the question, Logan. I'm curious about if anyone has perspectives for researchers who are working out of traditional academic appointments. So if you're employed at a research institute or at a health system, if you're doing public policy work, does that change the way you approach the publication process? And if so, what sort of changes should you be aware of? Thanks.
You can see the panelists, the gears are turning. I mean, I guess the question could go kind of to formal academic publishing in journals versus kind of other types as well.
Sure, yeah.
Reports or other types of outputs and how those are viewed.
Yeah, so I know in our academic system, the journals, publications in journals has in general been valued higher than any other type of publications. But having said that, things are changing quite a bit, and more emphasis is coming onto the societal impact of what we do, and that includes publications elsewhere. So in our system, it's gradually shifting from publish or perish to more what are we doing for society, and can we actually bring our message out in other places than just simple academic journals. So that would be reports, or that would be websites, or that would be whatever other places that you bring out your message.
Adi, do you want to go, or I've got some?
I can add some to that. Thank you. So it's not so much necessarily traditional roots, but I do feel, and this is something I also struggle a lot with in research as well, is that so like it's awesome that we're publishing and that's really great and looks awesome on our CVs, but like I want to always remind myself, like, what's the point? Like my hope is that it will make a difference. And there's been lots of research on research to show that like, who's actually reading it, and does it get out to like the mass or the lay public? And something that I really care about, because I like writing, not just for research and academic purposes, but also in more mass media. So I've written for the Globe and Mail, which is one of our biggest newspapers in Canada. You know, reaching out to, I guess, not necessarily academic journals, but to kind of pitch a story to a journalist that is a science journalist or a research journalist and say, like, this is something that I'm working on that I think would be of interest to the public. And a lot of time journalists are looking for stories, so they're very excited that you're even reaching out. And I would really advocate and suggest that. It's a little bit outside the box, but it's also a very simple and easy thing to do. And it also really helps get the attention, and it helps raise your profile as well. Because again, it could be published in a journal, but like it may be such that not a lot of people hear about it or get to know about it. So yeah, I would really encourage to reach out to newspapers and the news, other forms of media.
So I will second this, and I want to put in a plug for a venue that I've published in multiple times and that I really think has a lot to offer academics, which is theconversation.com. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is a site which pairs academic or research authors with professional editors to write pieces which are then published with Creative Commons license, so free for republishing, of 800 to 1,000 words, often get picked up by a variety of mainstream news outlets, definitely get read by journalists looking for stories, etc., for which you can then link your published research paper or your preprint, etc., as a way of drawing people's attention towards the work that you've already done, the work that others have done in your area of topic, as well as your expertise. I found it a really interesting way of highlighting, well, not only highlighting work that you're doing, but really expressing important information for this point in time. If we talk about the larger impact of the work that we do, a lot of what we do has important relevance to broader issues within society. And writing for those kinds of audiences can be beneficial for your academic career in addition to trying to boost your impact.
That's an excellent suggestion. I'm going to turn now to another audience question from Jenny Spencer. Jenny?
Hi, everybody. Thanks. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I want to jump forward. So we've picked our journal and we've gotten all the way to a revision. And now the revisions come back and I'm going to say it's 80%, super helpful, great point, really agree, make the changes. It's like 5%, that's definitely wrong, here is why. And then what am I missing? 15. It's 15% then is like, kind of could go either way, right? It comes down to maybe preferences, or somebody wants the results reported as a odds ratio or risk ratio or something, there are differences that you could change. Where do you come down on how you make those splits? What do you change versus don't change when you're in that sort of gray area for revisions, and how do you make that call?
I think this one should probably go to me first, given the situation. My short answer is this: own your work. If you believe that you're doing the right thing, then defend it. If you believe that the reviewers have raised an important issue, then own that and make the changes. And if you're really stuck, ask the editor, right? The action editor should be taking the role of saying, this is what I want you to do in order to have this article be publishable. And sometimes we face reviews that are conflicting with each other. Sometimes we face reviews that are not actually actionable in the time frame that you've got available for revisions, things like that. And it is not unreasonable for you to then, this isn't challenging a decision. This is just simply saying, what should I do about this? I recognize what the reviewers have given me. What should I do? I certainly, as an associate editor, have always tried to provide guidance when I saw situations like that. So I would write things like, pay particular attention to points 2, 3, and 4 from reviewer 2, acknowledge the issue that reviewer 1 made, but you move forward, stuff like that, to provide guidance to you to make those kinds of choices.
I am in a kind of similar position, but a really unique situation, which I've tweeted about and Logan retweeted, which was I'm currently dealing with a revise and resubmit with 16 reviewers. Yeah, I tweeted that because I was like, this has to be a record. I'm really early in my career. Like, I haven't published a ton. I've had a few rejections. I've seen 4 reviewers, maybe 5 reviewers, but like 16 reviewers, I was really, really shocked and intimidated by that. And in connecting with Brian and Miriam, actually before, kind of little bit of preparing for today's talk, Brian had given me that suggestion. To be honest, I actually haven't heard from the editor yet, which I'm kind of sad about, but one thing I will say is, I really like what Brian said about owning your stuff and, standing by the things that you think make sense and you want to, and justify it, of course. And then I'm really running into the problem where it's 16 reviewers, so it's 16 different opinions. A lot of them overlap, fortunately. So a lot of them they agree in what they like and what they don't like. So that really helps. But then sometimes they don't agree. And it's actually been really funny responding, writing my response. And I'll say like, thank you, reviewer 2. Like, this is in direct conflict with what reviewer 6 said, and I'm gonna go with reviewer 6 said. So and that kind of helps me because I have someone else who's rooting for something that I have, and then so it helps when I can kind of pit reviewers against each other. But yeah, it's been a really interesting process. I haven't submitted my new version yet, so Jenny, you and I can talk about it later. But yeah, I really wanted to second what Brian said in terms of, getting that feedback from the editor, still waiting on that, and then owning the stuff that you think, that you really want to stand by.
Yes, I think everything has really been said that I also think feel rather strongly about. We've just had a paper where we have a 16-page rebuttal, and that's with Bart Verkert, who's also on the call right now. Yeah, it can get pretty tedious. In general, I agree fully with Brian. Own your work. You need to really stand behind what you change and what you do. Having said that, I'm also sometimes rather practical. I mean, if it's a change that that I feel is okay, I wouldn't really want to make it, but it's not a big effort, and if the reviewer wants it, then it's like, well, make the reviewer happy, do it. If it doesn't, if it's not, as long as it's correct and as long as it's okay, then I would go for that. Yes, I don't think I can add anything else to that.
Let me just add one piece, though. We've been talking about this from the author's perspective. Let me put in a plug from an editor's perspective about what a good review should be doing. I really get frustrated as an editor with reviews that go on and on and on with 14,000 little minor points. A good review will prioritize. Will say, here are the main things that I am concerned about. And they may provide you with other secondary things, but they draw a clear distinction between the primary issues or concerns and the minor secondary points that can be dealt with. And that makes life easier for everybody. So I encourage you, when you get into this position of writing reviews, be clear. You're only going to be really pushing for, say, 2, 3, maybe 4 key points in your review. You may provide some other feedback, but that then gives the authors a very clear sense as to what the things are that they need to address and can do so in a concise way.
Excellent. I want to ask the question while I have the opportunity. We all know about the reputation of reviewer 2. Are reviewers set before the reviews come back, or is that a way of putting maybe the most critical review in the middle with easier reviews on the outside?
Usually the numbering is set by the system in terms of who was selected first versus second. So it's not actually a planned thing as far as I understand it.
Okay, just wanted to clarify. Going to turn to Channing for another question. Channing?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Jenny said. So this has happened to me a couple times when I've received a review for a paper and the reviewer is like, this is a great point. You should cite my paper. Here's the reference. How do you guys feel about that? Because it kind of feels icky to me.
Yeah, I always have to laugh when that happens. Then I just think, oh, this is an ego. Okay. And again, it gets back to Brian's point of own your paper. If it's really a relevant paper and it really adds and it's really important, then yes, sure, I'd do it. But if it's just off the mark, then I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and from the standpoint of my perspective on this, sometimes I see reviewers, they're throwing their things in and it's not well aligned, and other times I see papers in which I know that this is well aligned, but they're not raising it, and I feel, if I'm the reviewer, I feel like I would be remiss in not raising this because it is so relevant. But it should be the author's job to then make that judgment, right? To look at the topic of the paper, the relevance of the finding, and to be able to say, this is relevant, thank you for this, or no, that's not the direction we were going with this paper, but thank you for the information.
Yeah, I guess kind of speaking to what I was saying about earlier with the 16 reviewers, like I am someone who's very blunt and direct, so I actually sometimes need people to soften my language. Like I don't think that I'm like aggressive or anything, but like sometimes I can be very direct, and so it's hard not to feel emotional. Like some of the conversation themes earlier were about how hard rejection can be from journals, and it can get easier over time. It's easy to get defensive. We're human beings. It's a natural experience. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm the perfect person to talk about defenses and ego defenses. So it is very natural to feel that way. And so like it's important for me to like take a break and then come from a place of like gratitude, because some of the feedback, as hard as it was initially to get it, was actually helpful, and I do think will help the paper get better. It just takes me a while for me to get there. And it helps to like complain about it on Twitter, to have other people kind of relate. But yeah, so what I'm doing is, again, I think I might be too direct in some places and being like, no, like I think this works as it is. So I'm turning to my co-authors and my final author in reviewing my feedback, and just making sure that they're also okay with some of the decisions I made as the lead author on the paper.
Excellent. Nancy, I see you've got your hand raised. Do you have another question?
Yes. So I
Right.
wanted to ask about the co-authorship, and what do you think about inviting someone to be a co-author who might have a conflict of interest? So if someone like a senior person in that field, and especially again cost effectiveness studies where money factor is really important, do you think it really affects the credibility and the acceptance of a paper if one of the co-authors have like a conflict of interest?
That could potentially be the case, yes. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, if you're doing a cost effectiveness analysis for some test and that co-author invented the test, is selling the test, is making money out of that test, then you're putting yourself into a situation where you potentially would get discredited. At the very least, readers will question whether this is a fair analysis. So yeah, I'd be very careful about that.
I think, I mean, there's a comment in the chat as well about kind of the conflict of interest of asking to cite your own papers as well as a reviewer. So I think there's a similar theme there. One question I had for the panel, generally speaking, people aren't working on one paper at once. So when you've got kind of a few papers that you're working on at one time, obviously prioritizing or having some kind of strategy of what you get out at what time could be really important, especially if certain things are more time dependent than others. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on how you approach that kind of economic decision?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We're in the middle of that. We were working on one paper, then COVID came. So I see Stantia laughing. Yep, she's in the middle of that. So you see, yeah, you need to, at some point, if something is really urgent, then you're going to prioritize that and put all your eggs in that basket to get that done. And that's a strategic decision. You may have to wait on another paper that was important to you. But that's important. That's part of academic life.
Yeah, I'll throw one more piece here, which is a hard point to bring up, which is as you do that prioritization, either because something is particularly topical or it's really important to your career or it's, you know, a low-hanging fruit and you can get it out really quickly, all of which is relevant. There will be papers that will get not only stuck on the back burner, but fall off the back of the stove. It happens. It's painful to know that you did that work and then it keeps getting pushed back. On the other hand, if you're honest with yourself about what's the marginal value of investing time on this paper, sometimes the answer is you're not going to get a whole lot of return for your marginal investment in time, and you have to accept that. And, you know, I have data sets that I know at one point in time I thought were going to be good papers and they've never gotten out because they didn't turn out to be worth the marginal effort to push them. There was always other more important things, and that's hard.
Yeah, it's the principle of sunk costs.
Yep.
I mean,
Okay, I'm going to turn to Tara, who's going to read a question from the chat.
Thanks. So we have some couple comments people put in the chat. So Howie asked, this is a very nice discussion. Thank you all. I'm wondering what to do. What do you all think about publishing negative results? I find it hard to publish, but important to balance, but it's an important balance to the literature.
Something that I've seen is some journals will have a theme on publishing null or negative results. So I've seen that in neurology, which was really exciting. I thought that that was a really cool way of hopefully normalizing. It's a step in the right direction when journals actually have a dedicated issue for that. And I think one thing for those of us who maybe sit on editorial boards or are editors ourselves, like Brian, you know, I think moving towards that direction of maybe it can start off with a theme on that. And it is my hope that eventually it will become more normalized and acceptable, because I agree, there's a lot of, in the spirit of efficiency, it is really unfortunate that, yeah, there is a publication bias for positive results.
So one thing I'll chime in on here is a negative result can be really powerful and meaningful if it's in response to a clearly defined question or expectation. Like failures to replicate, not every journal will be interested in them. Medical decision making, I think, is, and certainly there are other journals who are, where there's a, you know, we expected X, it didn't happen. That's interesting, that's important. Other times it's grounded in the question of the quality of the way the question has been posed and the ability of the paper to answer it, right? We're always asking the question, is this negative result because it's not a well-designed study, or because it is a well-designed study and we're finding out that something isn't there? And so you know, making that case as you write up your negative finding, why is this clearly evidence that the thing you thought was potentially going to be true, the hypothesis that you had, the finding that had previously existed in the literature may not be actually true, is going to be key to getting a negative results paper to be seen as valuable to the field more broadly. I'm very open to it from an editorial standpoint, but I need that case to be made clearly.
and I will add one remark, and that's just, you know, what was the power of the study to actually show something? So I mean, if you have a very low power, then I think you could make a case of letting that paper fall off the back burner.
Excellent. So we're getting down to the wire here. We've only got about 5 minutes left. I think I'll just turn it over to the panelists for any final thoughts. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today that you maybe want to get across, or any takeaways from the panel? You've got a minute or two each. I
can start it off. So I'm, again, really early in my career. I am working on different, I'm at different levels of like rejection, revise and resubmit. You know, I'm hoping to get some publications, hopefully by the end of 2020, if not early 2021. And I guess one thing that I was really hoping to get across today is that in my experience of publishing a perspective piece, not only was it, sure, it looks nice on your CV, but it was like a personally very meaningful experience. That's the thing that I really took out of that. A lot of people from around the world reached out to say that they also have family members with severe mental illnesses, and they had so much that they could relate to in the paper and how meaningful it was. And I've also had people say that they shared it with others because they were going through that situation and how much it helped them. And I've developed a sense of community with people that I don't actually personally know, but know them through Twitter. And we like check in on each other. And I was not expecting that at all from that experience. So all I really want to say is that, you know, it is, a lot of us here are researchers, and for sure numbers, data, publishing, that all is really wonderful and important for our careers. But I would really advocate for, if there is a personal story that you think would help other people, I would really encourage you to give it a try. It'll be a lot more than you thought it was going to be. And if you ever want help in developing something like that, I'm happy to help out. You can email me. I'm not sure if it's included in the SMDM info, but for sure, I'd be happy to connect.
Miriam or Brian, any final thoughts?
Go next. I think the things that, it's actually sort of overlaps with what Sadia was talking about. The thing that I most want when I look at a new paper is, in some sense, just simply a clarity of the point. I want a paper that has a very clear question. Why is this, why should I invest the time in reading it? What am I going to learn from it, et cetera? I want a paper with a clear takeaway. Papers that present lots of information, but where if I look at the discussion, I'm not actually sure what I think the authors think is the main thing that I should be taking away from the paper, drive me nuts. And I want somewhere some of the personal passion of the authors, why they cared about this and why I should care about it. A really good paper, regardless of whether it's a modeling paper, or a decision aid paper, you know, a clinical trial paper, whatever, we do it for a reason. We ought to care about it. And that's why we did it in the first place. And when that becomes clear in the paper, no matter what the topic is, no matter how complex the paper is, it becomes a better paper. So I really encourage people to think about what is the takeaway points you want to make, in some sense, even more than your data or your results or your graphics, et cetera, because you can have the most accurate presentations of your findings, but if I can't figure out why I should care about it, it's not going to make as much of a difference, and it's probably not going to be cited as much.
Well, my final point is invest your time and your effort carefully. Only work on papers that are really worth it, that are in some way useful, that are fun to work on, things that you get passionate about, that you enjoy, and make sure you enjoy working with your co-authors. You know, life is short, and it's not worth spending your time and energy on things that are just not really worth it. So that's my final words. And thanks so much for coming here and listening. And I really enjoyed being part of the panel.
Thank you very much. I think on behalf of everyone who's here today, I really want to thank the panelists for taking the time to share their thoughts and insights. If we weren't on mute, you could hear all the clapter and applause. And you could actually see some of the virtual applause there. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. SMDM, you know how to make people feel special. I felt very special being a part of this, being super early career. I had major imposter syndrome. It was really, thank you. It really was a good confidence boost. So looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Talk soon.
All right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.